My husband didn't want me at the party. He made that clear before the valet even opened my door. "Stay in the back," Victor whispered, his smile fixed for the cameras. "Don't come near me. Your dress is embarrassing." The words landed softly the way practiced cruelty always does. Not shouted, not argued, just delivered like a fact everyone was expected to accept. I nodded because nodding had become muscle memory after 20 years of marriage. Because correcting him in public would cost more than it was worth. Because I had learned that humiliation could be survived if it was quiet. The house was packed with executives, donors, investors, people who spoke in low voices about numbers large enough to swallow cities. Crystal glasses clinked. Laughter rose and fell like background noise in a place I was never meant to occupy. Victor moved through the room effortlessly, his hand always on a shoulder that mattered, his laugh perfectly timed. I drifted where he told me to stand, the edge of the room, half shadow, half decoration. Then the front doors opened. The sound changed first. Conversations thinned, then stalled. A ripple moved through the crowd, subtle but unmistakable. Victor straightened instinctively. This was the moment he had been waiting for all night. The new owner had arrived. Victor stepped forward, extending his hand, his confidence sharpened to a blade. The billionaire didn't even look at it. He walked past my husband as if he weren't there, straight toward me. He stopped inches away, took my hands in his without hesitation. His grip was steady, his eyes were not. "I finally found you," he said, his voice breaking just enough for me to hear it. After 20 years, I never stopped. Behind us, I heard glass shatter against marble. For a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. I should have known something was wrong when Victor insisted I come that night. In 2 decades of marriage, he had never wanted me at his business events. I was the wife who handled the house, the schedules, the silence. I stayed home. I stayed agreeable. I stayed invisible. But that morning over coffee, he didn't finish. He said, "You're coming with me tonight." I looked up from the sink, the plate still warm in my hands. "Is something wrong?" He didn't meet my eyes. "The company's been acquired. New ownership. This party matters." The word mattered carried weight in our marriage. It meant behave. It meant perform. It meant don't ask questions. "I don't really have anything appropriate," I said carefully. "Not for something like that." Victor finally looked at me then. Not really at me. At the idea of me. "Find something," he said. "Buy something cheap if you have to. Just don't embarrass me." That sentence had shaped my adult life more than any vow we ever exchanged. I spent the afternoon doing what I always did. I made myself smaller. I pulled a dress from the back of the closet, one I'd worn once to a charity luncheon years ago. Navy blue, long sleeves, conservative. I told myself it was safe. Safety had become my religion. Victor barely glanced at me before we left. "Fine," he said. "Just stay out of the way." The party was held at a private estate overlooking the city, all glass and stone and confidence. Victor disappeared into the crowd the moment we arrived, already in character, already selling the version of himself he needed people to believe. I found my assigned place near a tall arrangement of orchids where I could see without being seen. I watched him work. I had watched him work my entire marriage. He knew how to speak without saying anything real, how to make promises without committing, how to look important without being powerful. He needed this acquisition. I knew that much. Late-night calls, closed doors, numbers that didn't add up. This party wasn't celebration. It was desperation dressed in champagne. When the new owner arrived, the room bent around him. That kind of authority is physical. You feel it before you understand it. Victor sensed it too. I saw him straighten smooth his jacket, prepare his smile. Then the man walked past him. Toward me. I remember thinking briefly that he had made a mistake, that he was looking for someone behind me, someone taller, someone louder, someone who belonged. But he didn't stop. When he took my hands, the room disappeared. His eyes searched my face with a precision that felt intimate, invasive, impossible. He looked older than the man I remembered. Harder. More contained. But there was no doubt in his expression. None at all. "I knew it was you," he said quietly. "The moment I saw you." Victor was beside us now, his voice sharp with forced humor. "I'm sorry," he said. "I think there's been some confusion. This is my wife." The man didn't look at him. "I know exactly who she is," he said. That was when I understood this was not an accident. The past I had buried so carefully had not stayed buried. Victor laughed, a brittle sound. "If you'll excuse us." "No," the man said, still holding my hands. "I won't." The word landed with finality. Around us, people pretended not to stare. No one wanted to be seen watching, but everyone was. "My name is Nathaniel Hale," he said, finally turning to Victor, "and you and I need to talk." Victor's face drained of color. For the first time in years, I saw something slip through the cracks of his composure. Fear. Nathaniel released my hands gently, as if aware of the weight of the moment. "Not here," he said. "Later." Later felt like a threat and a promise all at once. Victor's fingers closed around my arm tight enough to bruise. "We're leaving," he said through clenched teeth. As he pulled me away, I looked back once. Nathaniel was still watching me, not with longing, with certainty. In the car, Victor didn't speak until we were halfway home. "Who was he?" he asked finally. I stared out the window at the city lights blurring past. "You know who he is." His grip tightened on the steering wheel. "I know what he is," he said. "And he's not someone you get involved with." The words echoed in my chest, because the truth was, I had already been involved with him once. Long before Victor. Long before this house, this marriage, this version of myself that learned to survive by disappearing. And as the city fell away behind us, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to think in 20 years. The life I had built on silence was about to demand an answer. Victor didn't speak again until we reached the gates. The security lights washed over the windshield, pale and unforgiving, and the iron bars slid open as if nothing had changed. As if the night hadn't split our life cleanly in two. He parked the car with more force than necessary, cut the engine, and sat there with his hands on the wheel, breathing through his nose. "Who is he?" he asked again, slower this time. I unbuckled my seatbelt. The click sounded too loud in the quiet. "You already said his name," I replied. "You know exactly who he is." Victor turned toward me, his expression carefully neutral, the way it always was when he was deciding which version of himself to use. I asked who he is to you. The question pressed against something tender and dangerous. I chose my words the way I always did, with him placing them one at a time like stepping stones over deep water. "He's someone I knew a long time ago." "How long ago?" "Before you." Victor smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's not an answer." We went inside without another word. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and money. Everything was in its place. The furniture we rarely used. The art Victor had chosen because other people recognized the names. I set my clutch on the console table and slipped off my shoes, my hands steady, even though my chest felt tight. Victor loosened his tie and tossed it onto a chair. "You embarrassed me tonight," he said, not raising his voice. "Do you have any idea what that scene looked like?" I turned to face him. "I didn't create it. You didn't stop it either." The familiar accusation hung between us. Responsibility shifted effortlessly in our marriage. It always landed on me. "He walked past you," Victor continued. "That doesn't happen to me. Not ever. And it certainly doesn't happen because of my wife." I studied him then. The controlled jaw, the straight posture, the way his anger never spilled, only sharpened. "Why does it matter so much?" I asked. "If he's just a businessman like you say." Victor's eyes flickered. "Just once." Because men like him don't do anything without a reason. Neither do men like you, I thought, but didn't say. He moved closer, lowering his voice as if the walls were listening. I don't want you anywhere near him again. I didn't seek him out. That doesn't matter. His tone hardened. If he contacts you, you don't respond. If he invites you anywhere, you decline. And if he shows up again, you stay away. Is that clear? It wasn't a request. It never was. I nodded because that was easier than asking why his hands were shaking. That night, Victor slept beside me like he always did, facing away his back a wall I had long since stopped trying to climb. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying Nathaniel's face in my mind. Not the man he was now, but the certainty in his eyes. The way he hadn't hesitated. The way he had said my name without needing to hear it first. I hadn't told Victor the truth. Not the whole of it. I told myself it was to protect the peace we had built, but the truth was simpler. I didn't yet know what the truth would cost. The next morning, Victor was already gone when I came downstairs. A note waited by the coffee maker in his precise handwriting. Meetings all day. Don't wait up. I poured myself a cup and sat at the kitchen table, the quiet settling around me like dust. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel restful. It felt expectant. I spent the morning doing what I always did. Laundry, emails, a call to the landscaper, normal tasks in a normal house. But something had shifted. Every familiar routine felt like a performance I no longer remembered rehearsing. Just after noon, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I stared at the screen, my heartbeat loud in my ears. For a long moment, I considered letting it ring, letting the moment pass, letting safety reassert itself. Then I answered. Hello, Marine. Nathaniel's voice was calm, unmistakable. I'm glad you picked up. I closed my eyes. How did you get this number? A pause. Not hesitation. Consideration. I've known how to reach you for a long time, he said. I just never used it. That answer unsettled me more than any explanation could have. You shouldn't be calling me. I know, he said. But last night changed things. For you, I said. For both of us, he corrected gently. I won't keep you long. I just wanted you to hear this from me, not through anyone else. I didn't come to that party looking for trouble. I came because I needed to see you. I'm married, I said. The words felt thin. I know, he replied. I didn't come to take you anywhere. I came to tell you that the past isn't as finished as you were led to believe. I gripped the edge of the table. That sounds like a threat. It's a warning, he said quietly. One you deserve to hear. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I sat there for a long time, the phone heavy in my hand. The house seemed too large, too empty. Victor's voice echoed in my mind, layered with Nathaniel's two very different kinds of authority, pulling at opposite ends of my life. When Victor came home that evening, he was all warmth and charm, asking about my day, complimenting dinner, touching my shoulder as he passed. The performance was flawless, almost convincing. Did anyone call? He asked casually halfway through the meal. I looked up at him. No. He watched my face for a beat too long, then nodded. Good. Later, as I lay in bed listening to his even breathing, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. Victor wasn't angry because I had embarrassed him. He was afraid because something he thought he had buried had just stood up in a room full of witnesses. And whatever Nathaniel knew, whatever history he carried so confidently, it was something my husband had spent years making sure I never learned. That was when I stopped thinking of myself as a wife caught between two men. I was a variable in a game I hadn't known I was part of. And for the first time in 20 years, I started paying attention. I started noticing things I had learned to ignore. Victor had always been particular. About schedules, about appearances, about money. I used to tell myself that was discipline ambition, the cost of being married to a man who expected more from life than average. But after the party, his habits sharpened into something else, something watchful. He began asking questions he had never asked before. "Where were you this morning?" he said one afternoon, not looking up from his phone. "At home," I replied. "Where I usually am," and before lunch I paused just long enough to register the question. "I went to the market." He nodded, scrolling. "Which one?" "The one on Maple." Another nod. Another silence. Then casually, "Did you run into anyone you knew?" The question floated between us, too deliberate to be harmless. I met his eyes. "No." He smiled, then quick and approving, like a teacher satisfied with a correct answer. "Good." That night I lay awake cataloging the changes. The way he checked his phone more often. The way he positioned himself between me and strangers at social events we attended out of obligation. The way he began mentioning his connections in passing, as if reminding me of the infrastructure surrounding him. It wasn't anger, it was containment. I realized how little I knew about the machinery of Victor's world. I had never asked how deals were structured, how partnerships were formed where the money actually moved. That had always been his domain. I handled the visible life. He handled the real one. And I had let him. 3 days after the party, a courier arrived at the house with a package addressed to Victor. He wasn't home. He rarely was lately. The box sat on the entry table, unassuming, unsealed. Inside were documents, contracts, financial summaries. I recognized none of the names, but the numbers jumped out immediately. Large transfers, complicated pathways, dates that overlapped with milestones in our marriage. I closed the box without touching anything else. I told myself it was none of my business, that this was the line we had drawn long ago. But the thought rang hollow now. If my presence could disrupt Victor's world so thoroughly, then I had always been part of it, whether I understood it or not. That evening, Victor noticed the box was open. "Did you go through my things?" he asked lightly. "No," I said. "I saw the package. I didn't touch it." He studied me, weighing something. "You should let me know next time, just so there are no misunderstandings." I didn't think it mattered. "It always matters," he said. I watched him carry the box into his study and lock the door behind him. The click echoed down the hallway. Later, as I washed dishes, my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I didn't answer this time. I let it ring until it stopped my hands steady under the water. A minute later, a message appeared. "I don't expect you to respond. I just want you to know I didn't come back into your life by accident." I stared at the words, my reflection faintly visible on the dark screen. The certainty in his tone unsettled me. There was no urgency, no plea, just fact. That night, Victor reached for me in bed. It had been weeks since he had tried. His hand rested on my arm, possessive rather than affectionate. "You've been distant," he said softly. "I've been thinking," I replied. "That can be dangerous," he said, half smiling. I turned toward him. "Why are you afraid of Nathaniel?" The question hung there naked and unprotected. Victor's hand stilled. For a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he laughed quietly. "Afraid? That's an interesting word choice. It's the right one." He sat up, the sheets pooling around his waist. "Men like him don't belong in your world," he said. "They disrupt things. They don't respect boundaries. Whose boundaries? Everyone's." I watched him carefully. "You didn't answer my question." Victor's gaze hardened. "Because it's not your concern. Everything seems to be my concern suddenly." He leaned closer, his voice low. "Listen to me. I have spent a long time building what we have. I will not have it threatened by ghosts from your past." Ghosts. The word landed heavily. "You knew him," I said. Victor exhaled slowly. I know of him. How long he didn't answer immediately. Then long enough. The room felt smaller. Did you know he would be there that night? No, Victor said quickly. Too quickly. If I had, you wouldn't have come. That confirmed more than he intended. After he fell asleep, I got up and went to the guest room, closing the door softly behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the quiet settle. For the first time, I allowed myself to remember the woman I had been before Victor. The one who had believed her choices mattered. The one who had trusted her instincts instead of suppressing them. I didn't reach out to Nathaniel. Not yet. I needed to understand the shape of the ground before I stepped onto it. The next day, I made a small change. I took my car instead of the driver Victor preferred. I went to the library downtown, a place I hadn't visited in years. I sat at a public computer and began searching. Corporate filings, acquisition records, names that connected and reconnected in patterns too consistent to be coincidence. Victor's name appeared more often than I expected. So did Nathaniel's. They were not strangers. Their worlds had intersected before, deliberately. My phone vibrated again. You're looking in the right places, the message read. But you're still missing one piece. My pulse quickened. I typed back before I could stop myself. What piece? Several minutes passed. Then the one Victor never thought you'd question. I left the library with the uneasy sense that I was walking backward into a truth that had been waiting for me all along. That evening, Victor greeted me with an unfamiliar edge to his politeness. You're late. I lost track of time. He smiled thinly. You should be careful with that. I met his gaze. Why? Because things change quickly, he said. And not everyone adapts well. As I lay in bed that night staring into the dark, I finally admitted what I had been avoiding since the party. Victor wasn't watching me to protect me. He was watching me because I had become unpredictable. And unpredictability was the one thing his carefully controlled world could not afford. The name surfaced before I could stop it. Nathaniel. I was standing at the kitchen sink when it happened, hands submerged in warm water, staring at nothing. The sound of the faucet faded, replaced by the echo of a voice I hadn't heard in 20 years. Not imagined. Remembered. Precise in a way that memory usually isn't. I shut off the water too quickly, droplets splashing onto the counter. No, I said out loud as if that might push the thought back where it belonged. I dried my hands, folded the towel with unnecessary care, and reminded myself of the life I had built. The house, the marriage, the rules that kept everything intact. I did not have a past that mattered anymore. That was the story I had told myself for 2 decades, and it had worked because it needed to. Because survival sometimes depends on forgetting who you were before you learned how to endure. But forgetting isn't the same as erasing. That afternoon, I found myself replaying the moment at the party, not Victor's anger or the shattered glass, but Nathaniel's face when he saw me. Not surprise, not confusion, recognition. As if he had been waiting for that exact angle of light, that exact version of me to confirm something he already knew. That certainty frightened me more than his words. I tried to stay in the present. I answered emails. I reviewed the household accounts. I moved through my day with deliberate normalcy. But every familiar task felt thin, like a costume I could suddenly see the seams of. By evening, the past began to press in, not loudly, but persistently. I remembered myself at 26 standing in a small office with mismatched furniture and too much sunlight arguing over a project proposal I had worked on for weeks. I remembered the way my voice had sounded then, sure and unguarded. I remembered Nathaniel leaning back in his chair, listening instead of interrupting, his eyes sharp with interest rather than judgment. "You're not wrong," he had said finally. "You're just early." No one had ever said that to me before. Back then, he wasn't powerful. Not yet. He was driven, impatient, already thinking 10 steps ahead of everyone else in the room, but his ambition hadn't hardened into armor. He challenged me because he assumed I could meet him there, not because he needed to win. I had mistaken that for safety. I shook my head as if dislodging the memory might make it lose its grip. That was another life, another version of me. One who hadn't yet learned the cost of wanting more than she was allowed. Victor came home late that night. He moved through the house with purpose, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and controlled. I stayed in the living room, a book open in my lap, my eyes scanning the same paragraph over and over without absorbing a word. When he ended the call, he looked at me like he had just remembered I was there. "You're quiet," he said. "I usually am." He smiled faintly. "Not like this." I didn't respond. I was watching the way his jaw tightened, the way his gaze flicked briefly to my phone on the table beside me. He was alert in a way that had nothing to do with work. "You should avoid thinking about him," Victor said, as if offering advice. "Men like that thrive on disruption. Men like what I asked." He waved a hand. "Men who don't respect boundaries." I thought of Nathaniel's voice on the phone. Calm. Measured. Not demanding anything from me, just stating facts. I thought of Victor's rules the way they had expanded over the years until I could no longer see where they ended. "Boundaries protect people," I said. "Or they protect systems." Victor studied me for a moment, then turned away. "Get some rest." That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake staring at the ceiling and allowed myself one controlled descent into memory. Just one. I remembered the day I walked away. The office had been quiet, most people already gone. Nathaniel stood by the window, his back to me. The city spread out below like a promise. I had rehearsed my words carefully. I told him I needed something simpler, that our paths were diverging, that I didn't see a future where I fit into the life he was building. He listened without interrupting, just as he always had. When I finished, he turned toward me, his expression unreadable. "That's not the truth," he said. "It's the decision," I replied. For a long moment he said nothing. "Then, if you ever change your mind, you know where to find me." I had nodded, grateful he didn't push. Grateful he didn't ask the one question I couldn't answer. I told myself I was doing the responsible thing, the safe thing. I told myself love was a luxury I could afford to give up. What I never told myself was what that decision would cost. Now lying beside Victor's sleeping form, I understood something with unsettling clarity. Nathaniel hadn't looked at me like a man revisiting a memory. He had looked at me like someone closing a circle. The next morning I received an email. It wasn't personal, not on the surface. An invitation to a professional luncheon hosted by one of Nathaniel's foundations. My name listed among the attendees. My role described in vague, polite terms that didn't quite fit. Victor saw it on my screen before I could close it. "What's that?" he asked. "An invitation," I said carefully. "To what?" "A luncheon." He stepped closer, reading over my shoulder. I felt the familiar instinct to shrink, to apologize, to explain. I resisted it. "You're not going," Victor said. I haven't responded. "You're not going," he repeated, sharper this time. I turned to face him. "Why?" "Because it's unnecessary," he said. "And because it complicates things. Things have been complicated since the party." His eyes darkened. "You don't know what you're talking about." I thought of the documents in his study, the locked door, the way his name appeared in places it shouldn't. I thought of Nathaniel's message, the piece I was still missing. "I think I know enough to ask questions," I said. Victor laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "Be careful," he said. "Curiosity has consequences." After he left for the day, I sat alone at the table and opened the email again. I read it slowly, noticing what wasn't said as much as what was. This wasn't a social gesture. It was a signal. Nathaniel wasn't trying to pull me back into the past. He was positioning the present. I didn't reply. Not yet. But I didn't delete it either. That evening, as I set the table for two, I felt something shift inside me. Not hope. Not fear. Recognition. The choice I had made 20 years ago had not ended anything. It had simply delayed the reckoning. And now the life I had built on silence was asking me to decide whether I would continue to protect it, or finally ask why it needed protecting at all. Victor insisted we leave early the next night, even though there was nowhere in particular to go. He claimed he had a headache, that the dinner we were meant to attend no longer mattered, that it was better optics to be seen resting than socializing too much after a busy week. His explanations stacked neatly one on top of another, but none of them rang true. He drove faster than usual, his jaw set the radio off. The silence in the car felt intentional, like a test I hadn't been told I was taking. I watched the city lights slide past the window and said nothing. I had learned long ago that Victor used silence the way other people used questions. He waited for it to unsettle me, waited for me to fill it with reassurance. I didn't. Halfway home, he spoke. I don't want a repeat of the other night. I kept my eyes forward. Neither do I. That man, he continued, carefully avoiding Nathaniel's name, has a reputation for disruption. He enjoys destabilizing situations to see what falls apart. And you? I asked. What do you enjoy? Victor's hands tightened on the wheel. I enjoy stability. We didn't speak again until we reached the house. Inside, he moved with exaggerated normalcy, hanging his jacket, pouring himself a drink, asking whether I wanted tea. He was performing calm, and I recognized it because I had done the same for years. We sat across from each other in the living room, the distance between us deliberate. I want to be clear, Victor said finally. I expect you to stay away from him. I already said I didn't seek him out. That doesn't matter, he replied. You don't need to understand the situation. You just need to trust that I do. Trust. The word landed differently now. Trust had always been Victor's favorite shortcut. He used it to end conversations, to close doors I hadn't realized were open. I noticed you didn't ask what he said to me, I said. Victor looked at me, his expression carefully blank. There's nothing he could say that would be relevant. That's interesting, I replied. Because you seem very sure. He stood abruptly and crossed the room, stopping just short of where I sat. I am sure, he said. And you would be wise to listen. The tone was new, not loud, not angry, but sharpened as if the words themselves were a warning. I held his gaze. You're assuming I don't know anything. His eyes flickered. I'm assuming you don't know enough. The conversation ended there, not because it was resolved, but because Victor decided it was. He went upstairs without another word, leaving his glass untouched on the table. I sat alone, staring at the dark surface of my phone, resisting the urge to check whether Nathaniel had reached out again. That night, Victor slept lightly. I could tell by the way he shifted, the way his breathing changed when I moved. Sometime near dawn, his hand closed around my wrist, firm enough to wake me. Don't disappear, he murmured, not fully conscious. I lay still until he released me. The next morning, Victor was attentive in a way that felt invasive rather than kind. He asked what errands I planned to run. He offered to have the driver take me. He reminded me of dinner reservations I hadn't made. Each gesture was small, plausible, and together they formed a net. When I said I wanted to go for a walk, he hesitated. Maybe later, he suggested. It's been a long week. I need the air, I replied. He studied my face for a moment, then nodded. Don't be long. I walked the neighborhood slowly, noticing things I had overlooked for years. The security cameras mounted discreetly on neighboring houses. The way Victor's world extended beyond our walls, invisible but present. When I returned, he was waiting by the window, his phone in his hand. Did you run into anyone? He asked. No. He smiled. Good. That afternoon I tested him without meaning to. I left my phone in the kitchen when I went upstairs to change something I never did. When I came back down, it was exactly where I'd left it, but Victor's expression was unreadable. "You should keep that with you," he said lightly, "in case I need to reach you." The implication settled coldly in my chest. "You know where I am." Still, he replied, "It's better to be reachable." That evening I received a notification from my bank. A routine alert, or so it seemed. When I opened the app, I noticed one of our shared accounts had been temporarily restricted. Nothing dramatic, just a pause. A reminder. "Is there a problem?" I asked over dinner. Victor didn't look up from his plate. "Just some adjustments. Nothing for you to worry about." I set my fork down. "You didn't mention it. I didn't think it was necessary." I waited, letting the silence stretch. Victor finally looked at me, his expression tight. "You don't need unrestricted access to everything," he said. "It's not practical." "For whom?" "For us," he replied. "I handle the complexities. You've always been comfortable with that arrangement." I had been compliant, not comfortable. The difference mattered now. "I notice you've been very aware of where I am," I said quietly. "Who I talk to, what I see." Victor leaned back in his chair, considering me. "Awareness isn't control. It feels like it." His smile was thin. "Feelings aren't facts." The familiar dismissal no longer landed the way it once had. I saw it for what it was, a way to reduce me to noise. "I won't be treated like a liability," I said. Victor's composure cracked just slightly. "You won't be treated like a problem if you don't behave like one." There it was, the truth unvarnished. I stood gathering the plates. "I'm not your problem." He rose as well, stepping into my space. "You are my wife," he said, "and that comes with expectations." "And ownership," I asked. His eyes darkened. "Don't push this." For a moment, neither of us moved. The air felt charged, brittle. Then Victor stepped back, smoothing his expression as if nothing had happened. "You're tired," he said. "We'll talk later." I washed the dishes in silence, my hands steady despite the tremor in my chest. When I finished, I went upstairs and closed the bedroom door behind me, something I rarely did. Victor didn't comment. He simply watched. That night, lying in the dark, I understood what had changed. Victor wasn't reacting to Nathaniel out of jealousy or pride. He was reacting because something he had carefully contained was beginning to move. And he knew, even if he wouldn't admit it, that I was no longer predictable. I wasn't his wife in that moment. I was a risk. The days after the party settled into a strange artificial calm. Victor behaved as if order had been restored. He left early, returned late, and spoke in the measured tone he used when he believed control was intact. He didn't mention Nathaniel again. He didn't need to. His silence carried the warning just as clearly as words ever had. I moved through the house quietly, observant in a way I hadn't been before. I noticed which doors he locked now, which calls he took outside. The way he glanced at my phone when it lit up on the counter, then looked away too quickly. The calm was curated, assembled piece by piece to convince both of us that nothing was happening. But something was. On the fourth day, the message came through an assistant I didn't recognize. Polite, professional, brief. An invitation to meet Nathaniel for coffee at a public place downtown. Daytime. Neutral. No personal language, no pressure. I stared at the screen for a long time. Victor's voice echoed in my head, warning me about disruption, about boundaries, about consequences. For years, those words had been enough to keep me still. Now they sounded rehearsed, stripped of authority by repetition. Avoidance had been my default for decades. It had built my marriage. It had preserved the illusion of peace. And it had cost me more than I was ready to admit. I replied with one word. Yes. I didn't tell Victor. The cafe Nathaniel chose was bright and unassuming, the kind of place where conversations dissolved into background noise. I arrived early and took a seat near the window, my hands wrapped around a cup I didn't need. When he walked in, I recognized him immediately. Not because of his face, though it had changed, but because of the way he moved through the room as if it belonged to him without requiring acknowledgement. He didn't smile when he saw me. He nodded, sat across from me, and waited. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I didn't come for explanations," I replied. "Or apologies." "I know," he said. "You came for clarity." The word landed cleanly between us. "You didn't look surprised to see me," I said. "That night." "No," he replied. "I wasn't." I studied him, the calm certainty in his expression. "How long have you known where I was longer than you'd be comfortable with?" he said honestly. "But I respected your absence." "That's not how it felt." "I didn't say it would?" He replied. "I said it was intentional. The distinction mattered." "So why now?" I asked. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "Because I reached a point where the cost of waiting outweighed the risk of acting. And because the company your husband works with was finally vulnerable." My chest tightened. "You didn't just come looking for me." "No," he said. "I came to correct something." The word echoed ominously. "You think my life is a mistake," I said. "I think a decision you made years ago was based on incomplete information," he replied. "And I think someone benefited from that." I held his gaze. "Victor." Nathaniel didn't flinch. "Yes." The name settled heavily between us. "You're saying my marriage exists because of you," I said. "No," he replied. "I'm saying your marriage exists because of him." I waited, my pulse steady despite the chill creeping into my chest. "Victor and I crossed paths long before that party," Nathaniel continued. "Not socially, professionally. He built his position on leverage and proximity. I built mine on distance and timing. Our methods differ, and I'm what I asked." "Collateral." Nathaniel shook his head. "You were a variable he neutralized." The words struck with precision. "He knew who you were to me," Nathaniel said. "He knew what your presence represented. And he understood that as long as you remained contained, he could operate without scrutiny." My fingers tightened around the cup. Contained how financial dependence, social isolation. "Narrative control," Nathaniel replied evenly. "He didn't trap you. He designed an environment where leaving felt impossible." The truth of it settled slowly, each piece aligning with memories I had buried out of self-preservation. "You could have told me," I said quietly. "Years ago." "I didn't know enough," he replied. "And when I did, you were already married. I wasn't interested in becoming another man making choices for you." I believed him, not because I wanted to, but because nothing in his tone suggested otherwise. "What do you want from me now?" I asked. "Nothing," he said. "I want you informed. I want you to understand that what's happening around you isn't accidental. And I want you to know that silence will no longer protect you." The words rang with uncomfortable truth. "I'm not offering rescue," Nathaniel continued, "or revenge. I'm offering context. What you do with it is up to you." He slid a folder across the table. I didn't open it. "What's in there?" I asked. "Proof of patterns," he replied. "Connections Victor assumes you'll never question. You don't need it yet, but you will." I exhaled slowly. "Why are you doing this?" Nathaniel met my eyes. "Because I owe you the truth, and because I believe you deserve agency." He stood, leaving the folder untouched between us. "One more thing," he said. "Victor doesn't know you're capable of seeing what he's built. That's his greatest miscalculation." After he left, I sat there for a long time, the folder unopened, my reflection staring back at me from the darkened window. The city moved on outside, indifferent and alive. When I finally returned home, Victor was already there waiting in the kitchen. "You were out," he said. "Yes." "Where downtown?" His eyes narrowed. "With whom?" I met his gaze steadily. "I ran into an old acquaintance." The lie was careful, incomplete. Victor studied me, searching for something he had always relied on before hesitation. He didn't find it. "That won't happen again," he said. I didn't respond. That night, lying awake, I stared at the ceiling and understood something with startling clarity. Doing nothing was no longer neutral. Silence had shifted from shield to weapon, and it was no longer in my hands. Whatever Victor had built around me was beginning to crack, not because Nathaniel had intervened, but because I was finally looking at it. And once you see the structure of your own confinement, you can't pretend the walls aren't there. I started moving differently, not dramatically, not in ways Victor could immediately name. But I noticed the change in myself first. The way I paused before answering. The way I watched his face instead of filling silence. The way routine stopped feeling automatic and began to feel rehearsed. Victor noticed too, even if he didn't yet understand why. It began with something small. A discrepancy in a monthly statement I had looked at 100 times before without really seeing. A transfer labeled as routine expenses that was larger than usual, not alarming. Just off. I mentioned it casually over breakfast. Did we change providers for the consulting fees? Victor didn't look up from his phone. No. The amount's different. He scrolled unconcerned. Fluctuations happen. Every month, I asked. He finally glanced at me, his expression neutral but alert. Why are you tracking it now? The question answered itself. I handle the household accounts, I said evenly. I always have. Yes, he replied. But you've never audited them. The word landed heavier than he intended. I let it go, not because I was satisfied, but because I understood something important in that moment. Victor wasn't used to me asking questions that implied continuity, patterns, follow-through. That afternoon, while he was out, I went into his study. I had been in that room countless times, usually to dust, to straighten, to retrieve something he asked for. This time, I stood still for a moment, listening. The house was quiet. The lock clicked softly when I turned it. I didn't rush. I started with what he assumed I would never question. Files labeled innocuously. Partnerships. Advisory agreements. Names that meant nothing on their own. But when I lined them up by date, by amount, by timing, a shape began to emerge. Victor had always said his success was the result of long hours and good instincts. The documents told a more complicated story. A series of quiet alignments, favorable introductions. Transactions routed through third parties who appeared again and again in places they shouldn't. And threaded through it all was one consistent truth. Victor's rise depended on not being seen too closely. I felt no rush of panic, no surge of anger, just a strange steadiness, like the moment after you realize the floor isn't solid and adjust your weight accordingly. I took pictures of nothing. I moved nothing. I returned everything exactly as I found it. That night, Victor mentioned the luncheon invitation again. You didn't respond, he said, his tone light. I didn't decline either. His jaw tightened. That wasn't an invitation meant for you. It had my name on it. Because he wanted leverage. Victor snapped. Then he stopped himself. I mean, influence. Which is it? I asked quietly. He looked at me for a long moment, then shook his head. You're overthinking this. I almost smiled. Overthinking had been his favorite way to dismiss me. It had worked for years. Later, as we got ready for bed, Victor reached for my phone on the dresser and slid it closer to me. You left this downstairs. I know. You should keep it with you, he said. Just in case. In case of what? In case I need to reach you. I met his eyes in the mirror. You always know where I am. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake listening to Victor's breathing, thinking about the word Nathaniel had used. Contained. The next day I followed a hunch. Victor had always assumed I didn't understand the structure of his work, because I had never challenged it. He mistook restraint for ignorance. That assumption had given me access he never bothered to restrict. I traced one advisory firm through public records, then another. The names reappeared, shells within shells, and then I saw it, a familiar address, a connection that tied Victor's earliest promotion to a decision that had been framed to me as luck. It wasn't luck, it was leverage. And suddenly, a dozen conversations from the past rearranged themselves in my mind. The nights he came home exhilarated talking about opportunity. The periods when he was inexplicably tense. The way he discouraged me from pursuing anything that required visibility. I wasn't his partner. I was his firewall. When Victor came home that evening, he was in a good mood, almost buoyant. "We should take a trip," he said. "Get away for a bit." "Why?" I asked. He shrugged. "We've both been under a lot of stress. The offer was transparent. Distance, delay, control." "I can't right now," I replied. His smile faltered. "Why not? I have things to take care of." "What things?" I met his gaze steadily. "Things you assumed I wouldn't notice." The silence that followed was sharp and dangerous. Victor laughed, but it was thin. "You're being vague on purpose." "Yes." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You don't understand what you're playing with." "I understand enough," I said. His eyes darkened. "You think because someone whispered in your ear that you're suddenly informed. I think because I've been quiet for years, you forgot I was listening." For a moment something raw surfaced in his expression. Not anger. Calculation. He was reassessing me in real time, recalibrating a risk he had never planned for. "You're tired," he said finally. "We'll talk later." Later had always meant never. That night as he slept, I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. I didn't contact Nathaniel. Not yet. This had to be mine. My discovery. My choice. What I found didn't shock me anymore. It confirmed what my instincts had been circling for days. Victor's power was real, but it was brittle, dependent on secrecy, on my silence, on the assumption that I would remain what I had always been. Invisible. When he referenced one of the firms I had researched over breakfast the next morning casually as if in passing, I knew I was right. "You remember Collins Advisory," he said. "They helped with some restructuring early on." I looked up slowly. "I thought you said they were insignificant." He froze for half a second. "Not long enough for anyone else to notice." "I said they were temporary," he corrected. The correction told me everything. I nodded as if satisfied and returned to my coffee. Inside, something settled with finality. Victor didn't know what I knew, but he knew I was no longer where he had left me. And once a man who built his life on control realizes that his most carefully managed variable is thinking independently, he doesn't ask questions. He prepares for impact. So did I. I woke up calm in a way that scared me. Not the fragile calm that comes from denial, but the kind that settles in after a decision has already been made. The house was quiet, the early light thin and gray, and for the first time in years I didn't reach for my phone to orient myself around Victor's schedule. I lay still listening to my own breathing, and understood that waiting any longer would cost me more than acting ever could. Nothing would change on the surface. That was the rule. I made coffee. I set out his mug the way he liked it. I asked about his meetings and nodded in the right places. Victor relaxed almost immediately, the tension in his shoulders easing as familiarity reasserted itself. He mistook consistency for compliance. He always had. After he left, I stood in the kitchen and began mapping the truth the way he would have if our positions were reversed. Not emotionally, logically. Victor's power depended on three things: money that moved quietly, relationships that preferred darkness, and a wife who did not ask questions. I couldn't dismantle the first two quickly, but the third had already changed. I didn't rush. I made a list on paper, not digital. Accounts I could legally access. Documents I had signed without reading because trust had been easier than scrutiny. Names that reappeared in his orbit like punctuation marks. Patterns matter. Victor had taught me that even if he never meant to. My first move couldn't be dramatic. It had to be invisible. I called a woman I hadn't spoken to in years, a former colleague from my life before Victor, someone whose name would never appear on his radar. We exchanged pleasantries, then silence. Finally, I said I may need advice. Not now. Soon. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer solutions. She just said, "I'm here." That was enough. I spent the afternoon gathering what I could without alerting him. Birth certificate, passport, insurance information. Originals I was entitled to but had never insisted on keeping. I placed them in a plain folder and slid it into the bottom of a drawer Victor never opened because it contained things he considered domestic. Later, I opened a separate checking account at a bank he didn't use. Not to hide money, not yet. Just to prove to myself that I could move something without his permission. The amount was small, symbolic. The significance was not. When Victor came home that evening, he kissed my cheek and asked what I'd done all day. "House stuff," I said. He smiled. "Good." Over dinner, I introduced a deviation. "I might be late tomorrow," I said casually. "I'm meeting someone for lunch." He paused mid-bite. "Who?" "A friend." His eyes narrowed. "Which friend?" "Someone you don't know." That was new. He recovered quickly. "What time?" "Not sure yet." Victor nodded, but his attention didn't return to his plate. The shift was subtle, but I saw it. The calculation beginning behind his eyes. After dinner, he made a call from the hallway, his voice low. When he returned, he was overly attentive, asking whether I needed anything, whether I felt well. The performance was careful, almost tender. He was reasserting the frame. That night I slept lightly. Not because I was afraid, but because I was alert. The next morning I delayed answering his texts. Not long enough to provoke, just long enough to register. When I finally replied, his response came instantly. "Where are you? On my way." "To where?" "Out." The phone rang immediately. I let it go to voicemail. When I walked back into the house an hour later, Victor was waiting in the living room, standing instead of sitting. "You should answer when I call," he said. "I was busy." "With what? Thinking?" His jaw tightened. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." He took a step closer, then stopped himself. "You're acting strangely." I met his gaze. "You're noticing." For a moment, the mask slipped. Not enough for anyone else to see, but enough for me. Fear. Not of exposure yet, but of loss of control. "Don't make this difficult," he said. "I'm not," I replied. "I'm making it clear." He studied me for a long moment, then smiled thinly. "You've always been emotional." I didn't correct him. I let the word hang there exposed for what it was, a dismissal that had lost its power. That afternoon, I secured one more safeguard. I scheduled a consultation under my own name on my own calendar with no shared access. I didn't prepare questions. I didn't need to. I needed the appointment to exist. When Victor later mentioned the bank casually, as if in passing, I knew the window was narrowing. "They've been tightening things lately," he said. "More oversight." "Is that a problem?" I asked. "Only if people panic." I smiled. "I'm not panicking." He watched me carefully. "Good." That night, I sat alone at the table long after Victor went to bed. I took out the folder, added one more document, and closed it again. Once done, there was no returning to ignorance. No plausible way to pretend I hadn't crossed a line. I thought of Nathaniel briefly. Not as a rescuer or a solution, but as a variable Victor had never accounted for properly. Useful, dangerous, not central. This wasn't about him. It was about me choosing not to disappear anymore. When I finally turned off the lights, the house felt different. Smaller. Temporary. Like a place I was already leaving in my mind, even if my body remained. Victor slept soundly, convinced the world still moved according to his design. He didn't know the first move had already been made. And once a system built on silence feels the pressure of preparation, it doesn't collapse all at once. It starts to tremble. The first official letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded with surgical precision and addressed to me by my full legal name. Victor was still asleep when I read it, standing barefoot in the kitchen, the envelope trembling slightly between my fingers. Not from fear, from recognition. This was escalation, clean and intentional. He was done pretending nothing had changed. The letter wasn't overtly threatening. It didn't need to be. It referenced shared assets, fiduciary responsibility, marital cooperation. Words chosen to sound reasonable, even protective. But beneath the language was a message Victor had always relied on. You don't exist outside me. I placed the letter on the counter, made coffee, and waited for him to wake. When he finally came downstairs, already dressed, already alert, he noticed the envelope immediately. His eyes flicked to it, then to me. You opened my mail, he said calmly. It was addressed to me. He picked it up, skimmed it, and nodded as if confirming something he already knew. Good. Then you understand the situation. I understand you're trying to freeze me, I said. He smiled. I'm trying to protect what's ours. What's yours? I corrected. Victor exhaled slowly like a man indulging a child. You're emotional right now. That happens when people get confused about their position. I'm not confused. You are, he said gently, and I'm willing to give you time to come back to reality. I didn't argue. I had learned that arguing with Victor was like shouting into velvet. The sound disappeared without effect. I'll be late tonight, I said instead. He paused. Where are you going out? With whom I don't owe you a list. That did it. The smile vanished. You're making a mistake, he said. People who don't understand how things work get hurt. I understand exactly how things work, I replied. That's why I'm leaving the house now. I took my bag and walked past him before he could block me. He didn't touch me. Not because he couldn't, but because witnesses mattered. Timing mattered. He was still calculating. My meeting wasn't with a lawyer. Not yet. It was with someone Victor never thought to monitor, because he had dismissed her years ago as irrelevant. A woman whose career he had once undermined quietly, efficiently, and without remorse. A woman who now sat across from me in a glass-walled office, older, sharper, and smiling with something like satisfaction. You took your time, she said. I needed to be sure. She nodded. That's how he keeps people. He convinces them certainty is dangerous. I handed her the folder. She flipped through it without comment, her expression tightening with each page. He's exposed, she said finally. Not legally yet, but structurally. What does that mean? It means he's been using your name as insulation. Quietly. For years. The word insulation landed hard. He's not laundering money through me, I said. No, she replied. He's laundering legitimacy. She explained it clinically. How my signature appeared on boards I'd never attended. How my presence softened risk assessments. How certain deals were approved because a long-married couple looked stable on paper. Safe. Boring. You were camouflage, she said. Not a partner. I already knew that. But hearing it reframed the marriage in a way that stripped it of even the illusion of intimacy. What happens if I step out? I asked. Then the camouflage moves, she said, and people start asking why. That night, I didn't go home. I checked into a hotel Victor wouldn't think to search because it wasn't expensive. It wasn't symbolic. It was forgettable. I turned off my phone and slept for the first time without listening for his footsteps. The next morning, the messages came all at once. Where are you? This isn't funny. You're embarrassing yourself. We can fix this. You're making me do things I don't want to do. The last one chilled me. I forwarded everything to the secure folder and powered the phone down again. By noon, the second move happened without my intervention. A call came through to the office where I was waiting calm on the surface, coiled underneath. It started, she said. He's scrambling. What did you do? I didn't do anything, she replied. I just stopped protecting him. That was the part Victor never understood. He believed loyalty was something you extracted, not something people chose to give. When the first inquiry landed on his desk, he assumed it was noise. When the second followed, he made calls. When the third came from a name he recognized but couldn't intimidate, he panicked. By evening, the story was already leaking sideways. Not headlines, whispers, the kind that move faster than facts and don't care about truth. Victor found me just after dark. I was leaving the building when his car screeched to a stop at the curb. He got out jacket-rumpled hair imperfect for the first time in years. You think you've won, he said. I haven't played yet. You're ruining everything. No, I said. I'm stepping out of the way. He laughed sharply. You think that makes you powerful? I think it makes me visible. His eyes darted around, aware of the street, the cameras, the witnesses. He lowered his voice. You don't survive this without me. I already am. For a moment, something close to desperation cracked his composure. I built your life. You borrowed it, I said. And now you're returning it damaged. He stared at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time. Not as a possession, not as a liability, as a variable he had misjudged. This ends badly, he said. It already has, I replied. Just not for me. I walked away without looking back. By the time I reached the corner, my phone buzzed with a single message from an unknown number. It's moving faster than expected. Stay where you are. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Victor's world was built on silence, on women who stayed in the background, on signatures that never asked questions. The moment I stepped forward, the structure didn't explode. It destabilized. And men like Victor didn't fear destruction. They feared exposure. By midnight, I was no longer his wife in the system that mattered most. I was a problem. And problems once named have a way of becoming uncontrollable. The knock on the door came at 6:40 in the morning, precise and unapologetic. I was already awake. Sleep had thinned into a shallow alert state where every sound felt intentional. When I opened the door, 2 men stood in the hallway, both wearing the same neutral expression Victor had perfected over decades. Mrs. Hale, the taller one, said, "We'd like to ask you a few questions." I didn't invite them in. I didn't need to. The hallway cameras caught everything. About my husband, I asked. They exchanged a glance. That was answer enough. I stepped aside and let them enter, noting how carefully they looked around. Not searching, assessing. They weren't here to accuse. They were here to confirm. They asked about signatures, about meetings, about accounts I had never accessed. I answered slowly, deliberately, never speculating, never filling silence. Victor had always underestimated my capacity for restraint. He thought quiet meant weak. After 40 minutes, the shorter man closed his notebook. "You may be contacted again," he said. "Please don't leave the city." "I haven't," I replied. "And I won't." When they left, I locked the door and leaned against it, breathing evenly. This wasn't fear. This was momentum. The kind that doesn't stop once it starts. The first headline didn't mention my name. It mentioned Victor's firm, framed as a routine inquiry. Language softened, cautious. Markets hate drama. But by noon, the whispers had teeth. By evening, his name appeared paired with words like irregularities and oversight failures. Victor called me just once. I didn't answer. He texted instead. "We need to talk. Now." I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Then I set the phone down and walked to the window. Below, traffic moved as usual. People carried groceries, laughed, lived. The world hadn't paused for Victor's crisis. It never does. The meeting that afternoon wasn't with investigators or lawyers. It was with his board. They hadn't invited me. They didn't have to. I had been on the documents longer than any of them. silent but present. The room smelled like polished wood and panic. Men who had once spoken over me now avoided my eyes. One of them cleared his throat. "We weren't aware of the extent of your involvement," he said. "You weren't meant to be," I replied. Victor sat at the end of the table, jaw tight, hands folded too carefully. He didn't look at me. He couldn't afford to. He was still pretending I was incidental. That illusion shattered when the oldest board member leaned forward. "Why," he asked Victor, "did your wife's name appear on agreements she never attended?" Victor finally looked up. His gaze found mine sharp and incredulous. "Because she trusted me," he said. "No," I corrected calmly. "Because you assumed I wouldn't notice." The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. One by one, the men began asking questions Victor couldn't answer without contradicting himself. He deflected. He blamed advisors. He framed everything as procedural, but the pattern was already clear. I hadn't been a partner. I had been leverage. By the time the meeting adjourned, the vote was postponed. Not in his favor. Not against him. Suspended. That was worse. Suspension meant investigation. Victor followed me out. "You think this ends with you walking away clean," he said under his breath. "It doesn't. I'm not walking away," I replied. "I'm standing where you left me." His hand twitched, then stilled. He glanced around, always aware of optics. "You've destroyed everything," he hissed. "You destroyed it," I said. "I just stopped covering for you." That night I packed the last of my things from the house we had shared for 23 years. I didn't rush. I didn't cry. Every object I touched felt lighter once I acknowledged it had never been mine to begin with. I left my wedding ring on the kitchen counter, not as symbolism, as inventory. The next morning Victor was detained. Not arrested. Detained. A softer word meant to preserve dignity. It didn't. The image hit the news by noon. His tailored suit wrinkled. His expression caught between outrage and disbelief. A man who had always controlled the narrative now reduced to a headline he couldn't edit. People called me then. Friends I hadn't heard from in years. Acquaintances who suddenly remembered my name. They spoke in hushed tones, offering sympathy I hadn't asked for. I thanked them politely and ended the calls quickly. This wasn't grief. It was recalibration. The hearing was set for the following week. Temporary measures, asset freezes, travel restrictions. The language of consequence moved efficiently once unleashed. Victor's lawyer reached out. Then another. Then a message arrived from an unfamiliar number. "You don't know what you're doing." I deleted it. The woman from the glass-walled office met me for coffee that afternoon. She looked tired, satisfied. "You could have stayed quiet," she said. "Taken a settlement." "I know, but you didn't." "No," I agreed. "I didn't." She smiled faintly. "He never saw this coming. He never saw me," I replied. That night, alone in a space that was finally mine, I sat on the floor with a glass of water and let the exhaustion wash through me. Not sadness, not regret, just the ache of carrying weight for too long and finally setting it down. Victor's power had never been loud. It had been embedded, woven into systems that assumed compliance. When that compliance vanished, the structure didn't collapse immediately. It began to reveal itself. Tomorrow there would be more questions, more documents, more scrutiny. The story wasn't over. But for the first time in decades, it was moving forward without him dragging it backward. And somewhere deep in the quiet beneath the headlines and the fallout, a realization settled into place with unexpected calm. I hadn't taken revenge. I had reclaimed authorship. And men like Victor never forgive that. The courthouse smelled like disinfectant and old paper, a place where decisions were made quietly and lives were rearranged without ceremony. I arrived early not because I was nervous, but because I refused to rush for Victor ever again. I sat on the wooden bench outside the hearing room, hands folded, posture straight, watching strangers pass who had no idea this was the day a man like him finally lost control. When Victor was brought in, I barely recognized him. The suit was still expensive, but it hung differently now, like it belonged to a version of him that no longer existed. His hair was uncombed. His confidence had thinned into something sharp and brittle. He scanned the room until his eyes landed on me. For a moment he looked relieved. Then he saw my expression and understood. This wasn't reconciliation. This was reckoning. The hearing itself was procedural, almost dull in its precision. Dates, documents, discrepancies. Words like pattern and intent surfaced repeatedly, each one tightening the invisible net around him. When my name was mentioned, Victor stiffened. I was called to the stand not as a victim, but as a witness. That distinction mattered. I answered every question calmly, without embellishment. I described what I had signed and what I had not, where I had been present and where I had been absent, how decisions were made without my knowledge, then justified in my name. Victor's attorney tried to rattle me. "You benefited from this lifestyle, didn't you?" "Yes," I said. "At the cost of my autonomy." "You never objected. I was never informed." "You stayed." "I was isolated." The judge listened without expression. Victor stared straight ahead, jaw-clenched, hands white-knuckled on the table. This was unfamiliar territory for him. He was used to rooms bending in his favor, used to charm filling the gaps where truth was inconvenient. But this room didn't bend. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was steady, unremarkable, devastating. The separation was granted. The assets frozen pending further investigation. Temporary protections issued in my favor. Victor's head snapped toward me, then eyes blazing. "You planned this," he said loudly before his attorney pulled him back. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Outside, the air felt different, lighter, as if the building itself exhaled once we were gone. Cameras waited across the street lenses, hungry for spectacle. I turned away from them and walked in the opposite direction. Power had taught Victor that visibility meant dominance. I had learned something else. Invisibility was survival, and choice was freedom. The days that followed were strange in their quiet. No more instructions. No more monitoring. No one checking where I went or who I spoke to. I opened my own accounts, signed my own name, chose my own schedule. Small acts monumental in their accumulation. I moved into a modest apartment overlooking a park where children played in the afternoons. I sat on the balcony with coffee I brewed myself and watched the seasons shift without permission. The investigation widened. Victor's associates distanced themselves publicly, privately, scrambling to secure their own positions. Deals dissolved. Partnerships retracted. The man who once controlled rooms now occupied a single cell in a system that did not care about his history. One afternoon, a letter arrived, handwritten, from Victor. He wrote about betrayal, about loyalty, about how I had ruined him after everything he had given me. He framed himself as a builder, a protector, a man wronged by ingratitude. He never apologized. He never acknowledged choice. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer I would eventually empty. That night, I attended a small gathering hosted by people who knew me as myself, not as someone's wife. They asked what I did, what I wanted, where I saw myself going next. No one asked about Victor. That was the truest mercy. As weeks passed, the case solidified. Charges became formal. Timelines tightened. The outcome was no longer a question of if, but when. I didn't attend the final sentencing. I didn't need to. Justice, I learned, doesn't always require a front-row seat. Sometimes it requires distance, the ability to move forward without dragging the past behind you. Instead, I spent that morning walking through the park, leaves crunching beneath my shoes. I thought about the woman I had been when Victor first chose me. Quiet, adaptable, grateful for attention. I forgave her. She had survived with the tools she had. The woman I was now didn't need survival strategies. She needed space. Later that evening, I stood in my kitchen unpacking the last box from my old life. At the bottom, I found a framed photo I didn't remember packing. Victor and me years ago smiling for a camera we didn't know was already lying. I removed the photo, recycled the frame, and threw the image away. Not out of anger, out of completion. For years, Victor had believed my silence was consent, that my endurance was devotion, that my presence was permission. He had been wrong on every count. I didn't win by destroying him. I won by stepping out of his narrative entirely. And as night settled over the city calm and unremarkable, I realized something that felt like the final turn of a long key in a stubborn lock. The story was no longer about what he took from me. It was about what I refused to give ever again. The morning I signed the final papers, it was raining softly, the kind of rain that doesn't demand attention but changes everything it touches. I stood by the window of my apartment watching the park below blur into shades of gray and green and realized I wasn't nervous. Not relieved either. Just steady. The kind of calm that comes after a long storm when you finally trust the ground under your feet again. The divorce was finalized without drama. No last-minute objections. No grand speeches. Victor's name appeared on the documents like any other defendant, stripped of titles, stripped of authority. The judge spoke, the clerk stamped, and decades of control ended with the quiet thud of a file being closed. When I walked out of the building, no cameras waited. No one cared anymore. And that, more than anything, felt like justice. I took the long way home, letting the rain soak my coat, letting the city move around me without asking anything in return. For so many years, every step I took had been measured against someone else's expectations. Today, there was only direction, not permission. That afternoon, I received confirmation that my name had been formally removed from every entity Victor once used as insulation. Boards dissolved, records amended. My identity returned to me piece by piece like property recovered after a fire. I framed my own life again. Slowly. Intentionally. I took a position I chose, not one assigned to me. It didn't come with prestige or headlines. It came with autonomy, with mornings that belonged to me, with evenings that ended when I wanted them to. Sometimes people asked if I felt sorry for Victor. I never knew how to answer that question because it was the wrong one. I didn't feel sorry for him. I felt finished. Finished explaining. Finished justifying. Finished carrying the emotional labor of a man who mistook obedience for love and silence for loyalty. One evening, months later, I attended a small dinner hosted by friends who had become family. We laughed over burnt bread and imperfect wine. Someone asked me what the hardest part had been. I didn't say the betrayal. I didn't say the fear. I said believing that my life had already peaked. That belief had kept me trapped far longer than Victor ever did. He was just the structure that belief hid inside. As the seasons changed, so did I. I cut my hair the way I'd always wanted, traveled without checking in, learned how to enjoy being alone without feeling abandoned. There's a difference between solitude and isolation. I had lived in one and discovered the other. Occasionally I thought about the party. The night Victor hissed at me to stay in the back. The moment the room shifted when the CEO looked past him and saw me. Not as an accessory, not as a liability, as a person. That moment hadn't saved me. It had reminded me of who I was before I learned to make myself small, of who I could still be. People like to call stories like mine revenge. They expect bitterness, punishment, a villain crushed under poetic justice. But revenge wasn't what carried me through. Clarity did. I didn't destroy Victor's life. He did that himself, brick by brick, every time he chose control over partnership manipulation, over honesty. I simply stopped being the wall that hid the cracks. And when the wall stepped aside, the truth collapsed the structure. There's a quiet power in that kind of ending. No shouting, no spectacle. just a woman walking forward with her name intact. Sometimes late at night I sit by the window with a cup of tea and think about how many women live inside stories like this. Different details, same pattern. Told they are too old, too dependent, too late to start over. If you're listening to this and something in it feels uncomfortably familiar, I want you to know this. It's never too late to choose yourself. Not loudly, not recklessly, but deliberately. You don't need to burn everything down to reclaim your life. Sometimes all it takes is stepping out of the shadows someone else convinced you belonged in. And if this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment where someone underestimated you only for the truth to surface later? Or a time when you finally chose yourself after years of silence? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your stories matter more than you think. If you want to hear more stories about quiet strength, hidden power, and lives reclaimed after betrayal, stay here, subscribe, keep listening, and let's keep these conversations going. Some endings aren't really endings at all. They're the moment you finally step into your own story and realize it's just beginning.